In this video, we're going to consider Bertrand Russell's objection to the cosmological argument. This is from his essay, Why I'm Not a Christian, and it's one of your readings for today. So, here is Bertrand Russell. This is him later in life. He lived from 1872 to 1970, so he was 98 years old when he died, and he was really a towering figure in English Anglophone philosophy while he was alive. He started writing at the end of the 1800s and continued all the way up until his death, or very near his death in 1970. So where is the reading that we're looking at today from? So we're just looking at one paragraph of a much larger essay, but it was originally delivered as a lecture titled, Why I'm Not a Christian, delivered to the National Secular Society in London, England in 1927. It was published as a pamphlet, or what you might think of as a very skinny book, also in 1927. But the essay, Why I'm Not a Christian, became popular again in 1957 when it was republished as a part of a book of essays by Russell called Why I'm Not a Christian and Other Essays. So let's begin by looking at the argument. So, because Russell's a very good philosopher, before he critiques the ontological argument, he presents the argument so we know exactly what the argument is that he's objecting to. So that's what he's doing here. Perhaps the simplest and easiest to understand is the argument of the first cause. Now, Russell here calls the ontological argument the argument of the first cause. It's maintained that everything we see in the world has a cause, and as you go back in the chain of causes further and further, you must come to a first cause. And to that first cause, you give the name God. Okay, let's draw the argument out of this passage. So here we see the first premise. Everything in the world has a cause. Next, we can find the second premise here. If you go back in the chain of causes further and further, you must come to a first cause. All right. And then here, we see Russell presenting the conclusion. That first cause is God. Now, it's an open question and something that we should always ask if this is a fair rendering of Aquinas' argument. Now, in the case where we don't think it's fair, we need to use the principle of charity and make it as strong of an argument as possible, unless we think that Russell is not being fair to the argument in that he's objecting to a weaker version of it. Then we would need to call attention to that and say that Russell is not being charitable. But that's a question for another time. Okay, let's look at his objection to the ontological argument. So, before he gives his objection, he sets up a little bit what he's talking about by telling a story. I must say that when I was a young man and was debating these questions very seriously in my mind, I, for a long time, accepted the argument of the first cause, until one day, at the age of 18, I read John Stuart Mill's autobiography, and I there found this sentence. My father taught me that the question, who made me, cannot be answered, since it immediately suggests the further question, who made God? That very simple sentence showed me, as I still think, the fallacy in the argument of the first cause. Okay, now this is the part where Russell presents his objection. And as I see it, he actually ends up presenting 4 different possible objections. I'll read it. if everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. If there can be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world as God, so that there cannot be any validity in that argument. This is the first cause argument. There's no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause, nor, on the other hand, is there any reason why it should not have always existed. There's no reason to suppose that the world has a beginning at all. The idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination. Therefore, perhaps, I need not waste any more time upon the argument about the first cause. Okay, so as I said, I see 4 different possible lines of objection in this argument. And I'll point out here that although Russell is a very good philosopher, we have to remember that he's talking to a popular audience, and he's practicing effectively what I would call the shotgun method here, presenting every possible reason he can to object to the ontological argument. Now, in your philosophy papers, I do not want you to practice this strategy. I want you to just focus in on one objection at a time. But nonetheless, we'll look at Russell's 4 objections that I see here. So, the first is here. If everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. Followed by the second. If there can be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world as God, so that there cannot be any validity in the first cause argument. The third objection. There's no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause. And the fourth objection. Nor, on the other hand, is there any reason why it should not have always existed. There's no reason to suppose that the world has a beginning at all. The idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination. Okay. So, to sketch them out again, these are the 4 objections that I see. If everything has a cause, then God must also have a cause. Now, here, this is an attack on the validity or the structure of the argument, as we saw in the Anselm recap with the ontological argument for the perfect Big Mac. And the second objection is similar. If there can be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world as God, also questioning the validity of the argument. The third objection. There's no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause. And the fourth objection, there's no reason why the world could not have always existed. Okay, now I'm going to look at each of these arguments in turn. Okay, the first one. If everything has a cause, then God must also have a cause. So notice here that what this is doing is it's really focusing on what we mean when we say everything in the world has a cause. And the ultimate outcome is that what it's calling into question is the structure or the validity of the argument. What it's saying is that you could start with the first 2 premises and end up with a different conclusion, right? So if you really mean everything in the world has a cause, and if you go back in the chain of causes further and further, you must come to a first cause, then it seems like that first cause also needs a cause, and that we can end up with something other than the first cause, being God. Now, the second objection is similarly calling into question the structure of the argument. It's saying if there can be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world without a cause as God. So again, we can see that you could start with the first 2 premises. Everything in the world has a cause. And if you go back in the chain of causes further and further, you must come to a first cause. Okay, great. But what Russell's saying here is that that first cause could be the world, just as easily as it could be God. So the structure of the argument must not be right, because we can start with the same 2 premises and come out with another perfectly reasonable conclusion. Now the third objection objects to the first premise. The third objection is that there's no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause. So what this objection is focusing on is the first premise, that everything in the world has a cause. And it's saying, I don't really see why that has to be. Why does everything in the world have to have a cause? The fourth objection focuses on the second premise. The fourth objection is, there's no reason why the world could not have always existed. So the second premise is, if you go back in the chain of causes further and further, you must come to a first cause. And this objection is saying, well, why does that have to be the case? Why can't you just go back infinitely through the chain of causes? All right, so you may have a few questions, but I will ask a few others. So, what do you think of this objection? Does it work? Well, I suppose it's these four objections. What do you think of these four different objections to the cosmological argument? And if you don't like them, or even if you do, you might ask yourself, how might we respond to Russell's objection?